Welcome to St. John. Nothing Happened Here, with your hosts Greg Marquis and Mark Allen Green, a show all about a little city on the east coast of Canada where nothing ever happened. Except for this.
Today, let's travel back to July 1847. We are standing at the water's edge at Tin Can Beach, at the southern tip of the St. John Peninsula, looking out onto the outer harbor. The Bay of Fundy fog has barely lifted when we see a brigantine drop anchor in the lee of Partridge Island, a 24-acre rock located far enough from the mainland to serve its purpose. The island's distinctive red and white lighthouse is dimly visible. We hear nothing except for the cries of seagulls and the occasional sound of the island's fog bell. Following a signal from a quarantine station, we see a small boat rowing out to the sailing vessel and two men board by climbing up the unsteady pilot ladder. Let's join them on board. The ship has sailed direct from Sligo on the northwest coast of Ireland and is ready for inspection. One of the two men who just boarded is a doctor who will examine the cargo and baggage for cleanliness and the passengers and crew for signs of the fever. The captain, lighting a cigar, informs the inspecting physician that 8 passengers, 3 of them small children, perished on the voyage across the Atlantic, all of them succumbing to fever. The victims were buried at sea in scraps of old sail canvas. It was bad enough to see the tiny bodies being consigned to the deep, but the passengers were especially upset as no priest had been on board to officiate. An older woman who died after the ship entered the Bay of Fundy will be buried in the shallow soil of Partridge Island. None of the crew members were affected. We hear the captain and the doctor speaking. It is a sad business, the captain admits to the doctor, to lose even one steerage passenger. Shipmasters have been hearing that vessels from Ireland reaching Grosse Ile in the St. Lawrence River are losing up to half of their passengers in this, the 1847 navigation season. There was a bark called the Baran, which reached St. John from Sligo in mid-May. Dozens of immigrants from this vessel ended up passing away in the Partridge Island quarantine hospital, and more died in the weeks that followed. The doctor and the captain stand before the passengers, unable to make eye contact with them. Those who appear to be healthy are told that they will be allowed to land at St. John, where many have family, friends, and jobs waiting. Others will depart as soon as possible for Boston or New York. They think that they are the lucky ones, but the sad reality is that many have already been infected and will perish. Also, they will unknowingly spread the fever in the town with deadly results. Some will later pass away in the almshouse or at a temporary immigrant hospital in the city. For those who can't go ashore, the news is almost without hope. The doctor, in keeping with his training, tries to be as professional as possible. Please listen to me. You are showing signs of sickness, so according to the law, you must remain on the island in the quarantine hospital until the fever runs its course. Food and bedding will be provided, and a priest of your faith will visit you. Despite these reassurances, the fear on the faces of the immigrants, particularly those with children, is immediately apparent. Many will survive the stressful quarantine ordeal, but others will suffer painful deaths in hospital buildings or tents and will be buried in unmarked graves nearly 2,000 miles from home, victims of An Gart the Mór, the Irish Famine.
Hi, I'm Mark, and over there, that's Greg. And I think he might be sipping on an Irish coffee.
If only.
If only. And that means it's St. John, nothing happened here. The podcast that's sole purpose is to disprove its name. So, Greg, we're talking about the Irish famine immigration in St. John today. I understand you have a personal connection.
Well, not directly to the Irish famine. We're still exploring that, but my grandfather was from Ireland in County Mayo. He came a bit later, like just before World War I. My grandmother's parents or grandparents were from County Cork in the south, and they were surviving the famine around Cork, and we're still trying to find out more about that. And but yeah, I'm on my mother's side. It's Irish Canadian.
Okay, so those places you had said in Ireland, those would have been the epicenters of the Irish famine. Those would be in the southern and western part of Ireland. So I call that's a connection. Let's talk about the numbers to begin with, and then we'll discuss whether this is actually a famine or not a famine or something else that we should properly name.
Yeah. So about a third of the population of Ireland disappeared in 5 years. Half of it died and half of it left. So it's a huge impact on the country. So between 1 and 1.5 million people died, and 1 to 1.5 million people left, and over the period. And we're now seeing, like some historians are saying, close to 9. The population was close to 9 million, but definitely over 8 million, right? So, and Mark, how many actually died of starvation or malnutrition in terms of the
yes, and that's the thing is with any sort of starvation event, you have so many people dying of starvation, and then a lot of disease related to being malnourished and having conditions of displacement. Anytime you have displacement, you're going to have disease follow. So I believe it was 10 to 15% died of starvation or vitamin deficiencies diseases. And the rest perished from contagious diseases that accompany famines and the refugees.
Yeah. To your question on, what was a famine, I think there was it was a potato blight that started it all off. But I think there's a good quotation from John Mitchell, who was a Irish revolutionary who was arrested and deported in the late 1840s. The Almighty sent the potato blight, but the English created the famine. Mm-hmm. So it was Mother Nature, it was biology that sent the infection into the potato crop, but it was the context in which the people suffered, the lack of aid. And historians are still debating that in terms of the details.
Yes, and that's something you have to understand about famine is it's man-made. In a world that has the ability to move around food from a place that has no food, from a place that has food, you don't have a famine unless it is due to government mismanagement or intentionally trying to starve a people. And that's why there's a lot of talk about, should this be named the Irish famine, or should it be recalled something like the Great Hunger, which it's been known as, or the Great Starvation? Because we had a particular crop, a very valuable crop in Ireland, a very important crop being the potato. It had blight, but the rest of the crops in Ireland at the time were doing fine. They had a surplus of food, or they were exporting food at least.
Yep. So, Mark, what was the actual blight?
So let's talk about the blight to begin with. So what happened in, I believe it was 1845 when it first appeared in Europe. And I believe the first place it appeared was Belgium. Can you give us the Latin name for the blight?
I'll try.
I think you can pronounce it better than I can.
Phytophthora infectans.
Love it. Well done, sir. Well done. As a lawyer, I should know Latin way better. I should be able to pronounce it, but here I am. So we had the blight being introduced to Ireland, and it caused the potato crop to fail. And we talked about this quite a bit in York Point episode, so I won't go into too much detail, but we had a failure of the potato crop. Now, we have to understand the importance of the potato to Ireland at the time. This was a superfood that was introduced in the 1700s that allowed basically a person to, I wouldn't say thrive, but survive off of basically the potato alone. And they had one variety of potato, and it was the Irish lumper. And I read a bit about the Irish lumper, Greg, and it supposedly wasn't a tasty potato. A little bit on the starchy side, a little bit flavorless, but they had one type of potato. So that should make you go, ooh, this is a problem. Major amount of the population relying upon potatoes to survive, only one variety, which would make it way more susceptible to things like disease.
Yeah.
And so we had that come in 1845. Then what, Greg?
Well, the crop was lost, and that was okay. Like if about 30 to 40% of the crop was lost, but 1/3 of the population was more or less directly dependent on the potato, and maybe another 20% was heavily dependent on the potato. So it was maybe a crisis for one season, but following by a second season in 1846, most of the crop was lost. So now there's a cumulative effect. And of course, people began to suffer. I mean, if you had money to buy food was going up in cost, but if you had money to buy food, you could probably get by. But the problem is many people in Ireland were below the poverty line.
Okay, and didn't have the ability to supplement their normal diet of nothing but potatoes with a little bit of buttermilk.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving along. So talk to me about Black 47.
Well, it was, again, most of the crop lost again, and the cumulative effect, people were displaced, they were starving, malnutrition. So then you had reports of the fever, different types of fever, and all those attendant diseases when you get people on the move because of war, natural disaster, and things like that. So, people were lacking in housing, lacking in food, lacking in water, basic hygiene. So you had typhoid fever, relapsing fever, and typhus, which was a blood infection. Spread how, Mark?
Spread by the lice, louse, the singular, the louse, and as a group, the lice.
Yeah.
Typhoid was bad. Don't get me wrong. Typhoid was bad, but you had a higher survival rate than typhus. Typhus untreated was, getting close to a death sentence. Some people survived it, but it was a high mortality rate.
Yeah. And even some of the foods that were shipped in as emergency supplies, such as corn, made in the corn meal, had a negative effect on the Irish people who weren't used to it, and they didn't cook it properly, and they contracted dysentery, known as a bloody flux, and that had a high mortality rate as well. I read recently there's some people in Western Ireland who never tasted bread.
Wow.
They never tasted bread, and there were bakeries in Dublin, but they never tasted bread.
You couldn't afford it. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So the desperation, and I'm glad you mentioned it about introduction of different types of food to try to help. And if you don't cook these properly, of course, you're going to have the foodborne illnesses. And the other thing, there was such desperation, and you can understand this desperation to find food anywhere. So they went down and started collecting seaweed and shellfish. Yeah. And they didn't have the energy to forage around further to try to find something to make a cooking fire. So they ate it raw, likely knowing that the danger of eating raw seaweed, raw shellfish, but in desperation, willing to do anything. And then, of course, having the disease that went along with this. So we had all of that going on. But let's talk about the causes of this. I liked your line about, the Almighty brought the blight. But let's talk about what made it so bad. And if we can start off with the government response, I think that's a good place to begin. What did the government do? So in 1845, we got a failure of the potato crop. That's going to be really bad for the people of Ireland. Let's kick in a response.
Well, maybe not, maybe. I mean, it was a British government dominated by England, right? And so there was some response under the Peel government, I think the Conservative government, a little bit of victim blaming and some reliance, expectation that the locals are going to help out. But they did, to be fair, they tried to lower the cost of basic foodstuffs by repealing the corn laws or bringing in free trade and the importation of corn and flour and things like that. But that didn't have a big impact on Ireland itself. They also encouraged public work spending, Mark, which is what?
Well, for public works for this, it was basically putting in meaningless work projects for government. So they were building roads to nowhere to provide people with employment. Now, that would be great if everyone was capable of employment at the time, Greg. If they were ready and able-bodied, but they were starving.
Yeah.
So all the people who ended up getting the job supposedly were not the people in the most dire need of that type of support. So that wasn't going well, just with the corn laws too. So there's a lot of things before the famine that were contributing to the inevitable disaster that the famine would be. And the corn laws were there to basically artificially inflate the cost of food.
Yeah.
And for profit.
Yeah.
And so they were repealed to try to help things, but that didn't happen, or that didn't work very well. So you had public works, and let's talk about the workhouses.
The workhouses or poorhouses is where the deserving poor were sent, and often, women and orphans and children and things like that. But they were, it's kind of indoor relief, and it's a mixed bag because you could get food and shelter and some medicine, but disease could also spread. So at least you're out of the elements. The workhouses locally became more of a more relied on more later in the 1840s, but they went into debt, and many of them were like over budget, so to speak, right? And the soup kitchens too, Mark. I mean, there's some there's some reporting that they were fairly successful. At least they got some nutrition into local people. But after a while, what happened to the soup kitchens?
Well, there was the taking the soup, which was a problem with the soup kitchen. So they had a negative image around it, and it was partly deserved, partly not deserved from what I read. Some took the opportunity of the starving people of Ireland, mostly Catholic, to try to convert to the Protestant religion. So saying, hey, you know what, we're setting up a soup kitchen, you might want some food and we can provide that food, but you might want to be, checking your religious beliefs at the door and maybe consider Protestantism. So that was something that was done by a few. It seemed like most places that were running, even religious organizations, Protestant religious organizations, would not refuse people food if they refused to convert to their religion. However, that started spreading around, and it's like taking the soup. You do not go to a soup kitchen. So the Catholic Church was very much saying, you know what, it is better to die than to give up your religious beliefs.
Yeah. The Quakers were, and there were Quakers in Ireland. The Quakers were quite active, and also, Mark, we'll put a source in the show notes. There was an international relief effort by private donors, including from New Brunswick, to send money to Ireland, including Native Americans and African Americans and people from all over the world. But it wasn't enough. Private charity was not enough.
No. So you had under, as you were saying, the Peel government. They were trying to actively get involved and not in a way that was sufficient to deal with the crisis. But then you had a change in government. So you had the change from the Peel government, which was a Tory government, to the Whig government, which I think was under Russell. And that changed the whole focus from government-funded relief to a more laissez-faire position that, you know what, you guys take care of yourselves, and hey, this should not be borne. The famine relief expense should not be borne by the people of Great Britain. It should be borne by the landowners in Ireland.
Yeah.
Tell us how that went.
Well, it's the local property owners who, and the landlords happen to own a lot of the land, which they rent out to tenant farmers. Many of them are absentee, not all of them. Many of them are Anglo-Irish or Protestant. And, many of them were suffering as well. Not maybe starving, but they were in debt. They were not having rents paid, and costs were going up. And so it was kind of downloading to the local communities, including local landlords. So it kind of created a pressure point in the local areas. Some landlords responded in a humanitarian way. Others were broke, and others were somewhat cruel, taking advantage of the situation to evict their tenants, right? So it was there was no uniform response, but the landlords did get a bad reputation in hindsight, taking advantage and being somewhat heartless, But to be fair, there were people on the other side of the equation as well.
Yes, it was truly a mixed bag with the response. And there was, as you were saying, you had an increase in cost, drastic increase in cost, a huge decrease in revenue coming in, and heavy debt. And a lot of landlords did actually go heavily in debt to try to sustain themselves through this period, and was a last resort to do the more drastic things like the evictions. But one person that's standing out to me is the villain here. If there's a villain to be had, it's Charles Trevelyan.
Yeah.
What's your take as a historian? I'm not liking this guy.
He's got some damning quotes, and he was a member of the British government, or a leading senior civil servant. And again, there was this kind of evangelical Protestant belief too, that it's God's will. And again, there's kind of the racist or ethnocentrist view of the Irish, the Irish Catholics towards the English. And he's certainly been demonized in the very popular song, The Fields of Athenry, that's almost become the unofficial national anthem of Ireland. It's sung at any Irish music gathering. So I think most historians have a negative take on him, for sure, right?
Yes, with such lines, as you were saying, we do have some quotes. And you know what? You quote something and you go down in history as being a villain because of it. Well, that happens. But this is what he said. He did characterize the Irish character as being defective, and that they were a selfish, perverse, and turbulent people. Okay, not setting himself up well to begin with. No. And then he talked about when the Irish emigration occurred. So a massive amount of Irish people leaving. And here's his quote, Greg. We must not complain of what we really want to obtain. He rhymed. If there were T-shirts back there, I'm sure he would have got one printed up saying that. Yeah. So you know what? So his attitudes towards the Irish people really started dictating his response. And he was the head of the response for Irish relief, and got knighted because of it. He became Sir Charles Trevelyan.
And ironically, many of the Irish emigrants ended up in Britain, right? So he was hoping they would cross the Atlantic in the other direction. Many of them ended up in Britain. And again, if you read academic history, they faced almost a kind of racist response well into the 1930s in England, right? But
I can imagine.
So Mark, what about people leaving? The people who survived?
Well, just before that, Black 47,
right?
The worst of the worst of it, and Britain goes, it's over. Yep. The famine is over. We're good. Leave Ireland to its own devices. The crop is not failing. That's not looking at the facts before you. Okay, sure, you didn't have the widespread crop failure. You didn't have the crops either.
Yeah.
People were so desperate for food, they ate the seed potatoes.
Right.
So there was a long time. You don't just go, okay, well, 2 bad years and starvation like this and everything's fine. So they just go, we're not doing this anymore. It's all on you. So this declaring the famine over about 4 years before anyone would really objectively say the famine was over. But then we go, okay, it's time for the Irish emigration out. There's no food here. Disease is rampant. We do not have a future here. We're focusing on the emigration to St. John, New Brunswick, and to British North America. Now, why did that become the destination of choice for a lot of people leaving Ireland?
And we must say, too, that it started in 1845 to pick up, right? I mean, it already had been happening throughout the 1840s, but it's partly because, New Brunswick was a British colony, and it was because of different regulations and charges and fees to shipping in the United States, because a lot of them wanted to get to the United States, right? But it was cheaper to come in through Halifax Gros-Îles, Quebec, St. John, Miramichi, St. Andrews, and get on through to the United States. So it was partly there were shipping connections established between Ireland and Liverpool, because a lot of them, Mark, went to Liverpool and then took a ship out. But Sligo became a very important port for the St. John connection. So it was because they had established shipping lines, and it was cheaper to cross the Atlantic and end up in a New Brunswick or Nova Scotia or a Canadian port.
Yes, and I believe it was £4 if you wanted for an adult to travel to the United States, and you could do it for £3 or less if you went to British North America, which would have been a huge deal because £4 would have been a half year's wages, and that's for one individual in the time of economic distress and a famine. So here's the thing that I'd love to know, because supposedly a lot of people went over not on the landlord's dime, which I thought, or government assistance or charity. They went on their own.
That's right.
How would they have afforded that?
They must have saved up. They must have, there's maybe case studies, but most, Mark, left on their own resources. Right. And so they get to the ports to pay the ticket, the price of the ticket often included some food, but often they brought extra food with them. And then when they reach the shore, they have to be able to survive, the open-ended process when they reach the port on the other side of the Atlantic. But most were not assisted. Most went on their own resources. So there's a question of the ones who did not get out, right? Because they didn't have that money
So these would have been the more fortunate ones. And I understand that from like the 1845, 1846, because like the first people who left, Act 47 though, like how could anyone afford it after 2 years of trying to get by with, like if you had any resources for that, you think you would have already spent it on food. But that's one of the mysteries, and hopefully it will be explored someday. But moving on, as we're off to St. John.
Yes.
So let's board a ship. How do I get on a ship? I somehow came up with the £3 for passage. Right. Can I just walk on board a ship, or do I need medical clearance?
I think there was some sort of medical, I think it was like maybe ship owners or shipping companies were supposed to screen their passengers. I'm not sure it was a government thing. I'm not sure.
Imperial regulations, so that they were supposed to do medical examinations to make sure there's no disease. Two problems with that.
Yeah.
It was cursory due to the mass amount of people that arrived all at the same time. Yeah. And then things like typhus, Greg.
Right.
They have a latency period. So you might be infected, but showing no signs for 2 or 3 weeks later on. So they go, well, you look healthy. Come on board, sir and ma'am and children.
Yes, that's right. And, and again, more than half of the deaths who were recorded at St. John died on the ship on the way over. Right. So that tells you something. Right. So, then, but Mark, there were regulations. There was so much space for passengers, the provision of food and water. Right. And some captains were more, generous and keeping to the rules, and others not so much.
Yes. And then, you got 7 pounds of food weekly.
Yeah.
But did it have to be edible?
Yeah. Yeah.
And a lot of this is they took supplies on board, as some of the less scrupulous captains would put on supplies on board that would rot before that they made the 4 to 6 week journey. Now, sorry, just for an aside, I have to ask this. Australia was a destination.
Yes.
How would they have survived that?
Wow, that is a long haul.
That's a long haul.
But there's probably podcasts and books on that one, because it's a long haul.
That's a side issue. We're talking about St. John. I don't want to go off on a tangent, but I want to look into that, the Australia trip. Okay, so we have that destination. We had Quebec, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick. Let's talk about the immediate impact on St. John. So we're arriving in a place called Partridge Island. No, we're not arriving there, are we?
No. If only, Mark, because there's kind of this misconception locally that Partridge Island was like the Ellis Island. It's like the immigration landing. No, it's a quarantine station. Only if your ship was deemed to be containing disease or passengers containing disease, then you would be quarantined and maybe some of the passengers would be allowed to go on shore, but others would be placed on the quarantine hospital on the island until they passed inspection. Right. Unfortunately, some of them did die, and particularly in 1847.
In Block 47. And I'd like to talk more about Partridge Island. We just don't have the time. Yeah. But I would suggest our listeners go and download Mark Brewer's podcast, NB Traveler. He did a great episode on the history of Partridge Island. And just have to say, I love Mark Brewer's voice.
For sure.
Sam Elliott.
Yeah.
He has the Sam Elliott voice. I love listening to his podcast because it's so interesting, but I love his voice. But anyway, what were the conditions in St. John in 1840? Because we have to know, like, it wasn't a thriving place.
Well, it had been experiencing a depression. We talked a bit about that in a previous podcast, and there were business failures, unemployment, depressed wages. There was outmigration by the local people, which is always a bad sign. Irish Catholics were not new. They had been arriving since the late 1830s and picking up in the 1840s. You've already documented some of the ethnic and sectarian tensions resulting in violence and scapegoating. And in case of, July 12th, 1847, there is a York Point riot near the waterfront. It's a prequel to the bloody clash 2 years later. There are immigrants coming in. And there's signs. If you read the immigration agents and the doctors' reports of 1846, there's foreshadowing, Mark, of the problems of the next year. It's already appearing, right? But in low numbers, disease, people not wearing the right clothing, people not having enough money or food and things like that. So it's not ideal. And of course, conditions are at a crisis in 1847.
Yes. So they're going into a place that's kind of suffering to begin with, economically. And we had in 1845, 1846, 16,000 immigrants land in New Brunswick, mostly at St. John.
Yeah.
And then 1846, you start to have signs of more distress.
Yeah.
More disease happening. 1847, 1848, Block 47. The era of the coffin ships coming into St. John, and like the mortality rate was quite high,
5 to 30% on average, and it was either people dying on the way over or dying in quarantine, and some of the individual ships might have been higher. Now, normally, Mark, I was shocked by this. It was in a normal non-famine crisis year, it was 1%. So 1 out of every 100 passengers on a transatlantic ship would die, and that they were acceptable losses for the travel industry, so to speak, right?
Which is
shocking, right?
And not a single human life lost is acceptable losses, but I find it amazing that it's 1% when you have 200, sometimes 700 people stuck in the hold of a ship for 6 weeks.
Yes.
And how there wouldn't be a higher fatality, but like we were starting to see that. And then some ships, like the ones going to gross ill, certainly they were the higher ones. And I just have to comment, like on the bark Ajax, 100 passengers aboard, 50% died at sea.
Yeah.
50% died at sea, not to mention that probably a lot died as soon as they reached the quarantine station.
So normally at Partridge Island, they had a hospital and a doctor and attendants, but they had to set up extra, tents and also some passengers were held on ships, they couldn't get them off the island in time. And so they became overburdened there. And what else happened on land, Mark, in terms of the overflow?
Well, before the land. Yeah. As you were saying, held on ship, which made it much worse because you didn't have airflow going through when you weren't moving. So if you had disease, that made it much worse if you were anchored on a ship and not able to leave. But let's go on to land and see what's happening. So we have on Partridge Island, let's just talk about that. We have some heroes that should be noted. Let's begin with the Harding brothers, George and William.
Yes, they were 2 doctors, and it was their job. I mean, again, it's a heroic thing, but, they were not volunteers so much as, I guess they were there willingly, but, they were doing a job, right? And at great risk. And of course, it's kind of unknown in terms of the orderlies and nurses and helpers, but it's just that they're kind of lost to history in many ways. And you think now when you go into the hospital, it's nurses, people cleaning the rooms, doing the bedding. But anyway, so George and William Harding, but they became overburdened, they because of the numbers. So they had to hire extra help.
Yes,
right?
and the extra help was Dr. James Patrick Collins. Mm. He was a 23-year-old Irish-born doctor who was convinced to go out. The Harding brothers went to him and go, I think this will be good for your career, Collins, getting this type of experience. His family was like, James, no, don't go out there.
Yeah.
And he felt that compulsion to help. And he goes, yes, I'm going to put my own life at risk and go out and help. And he did. And he did a lot of good. Yeah. And he died weeks later of typhus. And
he became a hero, though, to many citizens in St. John, beyond the Irish Catholics and people on the waterfront and that type of thing. Right?
As the legend goes, the largest attended funeral ever to happen in St. John was Dr. Collins' funeral. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people attended, and they had to take special precautions, didn't they? Because of the disease.
I read that they had to ask for permission because there was a lot of fear about the bodies of diseased people coming ashore. So I think they had to ask special permission, and I think they brought him ashore in a lead-lined coffin, right, which is kind of staggering. And then, as so often is the case, he was placed in a burial ground, but in 19th century St. John, burial grounds kept moving around, right? So his body kept being moved as these different burial grounds were closing down and relocating.
So Dr. Collins died. Dr. William Harding contracted typhus.
Yep.
He was out, so everything fell on Dr. George Harding for a while. He finally got some help. I think it was Dr. William Mitchell came in to assist, and Dr. Wetmore eventually. But there was a point that Dr. George Harding went down as well.
Yeah.
And from typhus, both Harding brothers recovered, but Dr. George Harding never went back.
Right.
Dr. William Harding took over as the chief medical officer.
I just want to mention that the Ray Butler painting, the late artist Ray Butler, there's a really evocative painting of the sort of depicting the heroism of Dr. Collins on the island in 1847. And people ever get a chance to see that painting, it's worthwhile.
You can spend hours looking at the different parts of that painting and see all the different stories. There's the main Collins story, but there's so much going on in the background. It is an absolute stunning painting. I encourage all our listeners, go find this painting, go take a look at this. With the one thing I want to bring up about Partridge Island, because I watched one of the specials on Partridge Island that was done in New Brunswick, and Miss Block, who I call Miss Block because she was my 11th grade homeroom teacher, but Marika Block.
Yeah.
She said this, that in that documentary, and it just really resonated with me, is that there would have been people who had been dying on Partridge Island, looking at land, looking at their destination so close, and had been suffering so much, but would never get there.
Yeah.
But there was more than just Partridge Island. There were facilities on shore. And we had the almshouse in Simons. So that's in the east part of St. John. And then we had fever sheds set up at various locations.
Yeah. And there was actually the City and County Almshouse, which is kind of like the workhouse or the poorhouse back in Ireland. There was a temporary immigrant hospital added because of the unprecedented burden on the system, so to speak. And almost as many people were recorded as dying at the emigrant hospital, Mark, as had died on Partridge Island, close to 600. There were also temporary immigrant sheds put up down near the South End and Duke's Ward. And then, Mark, there was something called the Emigrant Orphan Asylum.
So a lot of new orphans. created. And the Orphans Asylum, that would have been on King Street East now. So that's on the peninsula, for those who are not familiar with the layout of St. John. So that would have been closer to the heart of the city. But a lot of orphans came in, and we have to do a podcast on that alone. There was a lot of work done to civilize the orphans. And by civilize, from what I read, that meant making them ready to be adopted by Protestant families.
Yes.
So that's an episode in and of itself. We won't go too much into that. But yeah, like, you got to be thinking about the children too, the orphan children, and the amount. And I never even thought of this until I stumbled upon it in researching the other day. How many babies were born on the way over?
Yep. Yeah.
So you can imagine those kind of conditions and coming in. So St. John was flooded with people in need. So we had, in 1847, 106 ships left Ireland and Liverpool for New Brunswick. We had 15,000 immigrants landing in St. John in 1847. 2,100 died in or on the way.
Yeah.
823 died at sea. 601 died on Partridge Island. 595 died in emigrant hospitals or at the poorhouse in St. John.
Yeah. So that's about a 15 to 14% death rate. And again, there's the 2,000 or 2,100 figure. There's, in some sources, it's claims it's for St. John only. In some sources, it claims it's for all of New Brunswick. Right. So there's some difference there. But yeah, it's certainly unprecedented. I mean, you can kind of criticize the city for responding with kind of stopgap measures, but it was unprecedented in terms of the scale and the resources that the city was used to, and I guess the provincial government also kicked in a little bit of help, right? But it was mainly the local people who had to respond to this.
Yes, and speaking of mixed bags on responses, you did have people trying to help, but then you had a lot of people saying, "I don't want a bunch of diseased immigrants in my neighborhood."
Yes.
So especially when they were trying to put together the fever hospitals or the fever sheds, it was like, not close to me.
Yeah.
Now, in all fairness to people, there wasn't the understanding of disease back then.
True.
So I can imagine the fear of the local population when there's this massive amount of typhus coming in. Yeah. Now, as we know today with typhus, it's a louse-borne disease. It's by it's spread by lice. Yeah. They can't walk down the street. They're not leaving that fever shed and going, okay, well, let's go off to the neighborhood. They really need the contact, human to human contact. They can't jump, they can't fly. Yeah. So, but that was certainly going on. And then let's talk about the ire of the city population, especially the city council, toward the landlords back in England.
There were some, they're kind of Irish-based landlords, but actually two of them one was definitely Lord Palmerston, who was a leading English politician who had, as often the case, had lands in Ireland, and then Robert Booth Gore in Sligo. So just to back it up, there were increasing negative reports from Moses Purley, who was the emigration agent who had been doing this for a few years, and he was reporting, "I've never seen so much suffering and neglect." And he was tracing it back to neglect in Ireland itself. There were newspaper editors and there were doctors as well, right? And so he was, Dr. Harding was outraged by landlords who sent pauper immigrants to New Brunswick at a time when local poorhouses and hospitals were overflowing, right? Mm-hmm. So Robert Booth Gore ended up, in 1847, 3 shiploads came from his estates in 1,500 immigrants to St. John alone. Right.
Yes.
And he sort of developed a bad rep, but I've done some reading on Booth Gore, and he was actually quite enlightened, And then Palmerston was a future, I think he was a foreign secretary of the British government and a future prime minister, right? So, Mark, do you want to talk about the Common Council's response?
I do. But just before with the Booth Gore thing, so St. John struck at Booth Gore saying, "You're the problem." Booth Gore turned it right around on St. John, going, "No, you're the problem.
Yeah.
Look at your facilities, your quarantine facilities and hospital. That's on you." So it was really this back and forth kind of thing. But then St. John Common Council comes up with an idea, going, "Okay, we're going to show these rich, greedy, heartless landlords in England. We'll teach them. We're sending the immigrants back."
Well, they want to, and so actually they couldn't force them, but they suggested that they would pay their costs and give them food and water, right? And they encouraged Catholic priests to strongly encourage that these tenants from Booth Gore's estate, and maybe Palmerston, go back, but no one volunteered, Mark.
No, but they passed the resolution. They did pass a resolution and going, "We resolve to send them back to Ireland." Wouldn't that have been horrible? Can you imagine after people suffered that much and they go, "Hey, guess what, guys? We'll pay for it, but you're going back 6 weeks in the hull of a ship again."
Let's go back to Syria. Let's go back to Ukraine.
Oh,
right?
wow.
So
thank goodness that didn't go through.
But the flak flew would go upstream to Fredericton, so the locals put pressure on the New Brunswick government. New Brunswick government did complain to the British government. I think the British government sent some money to help cover some of the costs of the famine arrivals.
And have to just this segment end off with, not everyone was happy with St. John.
No.
We have that quote coming from 1848, one refugee writing to her family saying, "Bad and all as we were in Ireland," admitted others, "we often wish we never seen St. John, for it's almost as bad as Ireland."
Yeah.
So it was some harsh conditions that they were going into once arriving in St. John. But that brings us to the legacy. We got to talk about the legacy of the famine on St. John.
Well, I mean, in 1848, although the famine wasn't over, crop conditions began to improve in Ireland, and a few more immigrants showed up, 1848, 1849. But the impact of the famine was felt for years to come in Ireland. But I think the impact on St. John and New Brunswick was more the memory of the famine and of Black 47, because according to Dr. Peter Toner and other academic historians, in terms of people, most survivors moved on. There's very little demographic impact, if you will, on St. John and New Brunswick. Most survivors moved on to New York, Boston, right?
Yeah, because their intention was never to come to St. John. Their intention was to go United States.
Yeah, and the other thing too is after 1850, large-scale immigration through St. John also tapers off, right? Now, there was an impact, of course, as we've already discussed, on the Orange Lodge and the relations with the Catholic minority, right? That was ongoing, and it provided fuel to the fire, so to speak, right?
Yeah, and for more information, go check out our podcast on the York Point Riot of 1849.
Mark, you said that you lived in East St. John where you could look out your window and see Partridge Island. So in terms of, I think this is a very important topic within the podcast. How was Partridge Island after this identified? What was your take on Partridge Island personally?
Yeah, so as a young boy growing up in East St. John, I could see it out my window. I could see the lighthouse going, and it was always haunting to me when I would look out on this. And as I grew up, I began to understand what Partridge Island meant. And it was not a place like, this is a beautiful island. It was a place of sorrow. It was a place where the ghosts of the past still roam,
right,
plagued with their suffering.
Yeah.
So it really is that. When you look at Partridge Island, you get those chills. It's on my bucket list, my St. John bucket list, to go to Partridge Island. I've never actually been on the island. I believe you have.
I have. I went out as part of an authorized trip to do a litter cleanup through ACAP, and I went out on the water. But I kind of felt too, Mark, that it was kind of, growing up on the west side and hearing the foghorn, because, there's a navigational history of Partridge Island, there's a military history, but it looms so large as a site of suffering in the past, even for people who don't have Irish heritage. And when I went out there, I kind of felt I was on hallowed ground, although again, it's not just Irish and Catholic people who were buried there. There were Protestant immigrants and even Jewish immigrants, because later, Partridge Island's quarantine station continued after 1847 for many, many decades, and there were other people buried out there, right? But one of my great shocks was talking to the expert on Partridge Island, Harold Wright, and finding out what happened to most of the bodies who were buried there on Partridge Island, not just in 1847. And World War II happened, Mark, and do you want to discuss what happened there?
I was hoping you would tell me this is not true, that this was lore, but the bodies had to be removed for the purposes of building military installations, and they were dumped unceremoniously into the harbor.
Or the bay, yeah. And again, they thought it was early war, 1940, 1941, they thought Hitler was coming this way, right? So gun emplacements, searchlights, machine guns, and it's the sort of thing that happens during war sometimes, but it's still shocking to think about that, right?
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, for a long time after this, there wasn't much talk about it. It was like, let's put this behind us, especially for the Irish people we've suffered enough. I don't want to relive that. But then there became a recognition of the importance of this event in history and the importance to keep it alive.
Yeah. 50 years later, I think it partly reflects the growth of the Irish, the Catholic population over time. There's a large Celtic cross that was erected on the island. You can still see it. I've been out there. It's pretty impressive. You can see it with, binoculars or telescopes, whatever. It dominates the island other than, the lighthouse. And a Celtic cross was erected there in honor of the suffering of the famine immigrants, as well as the heroism of Dr. Collins. And then what happens, Mark, in, Canada's centennial year? There's Expo 67. There's all sorts of centennial projects, local history, local heritage. What happens then?
So there's a Celtic cross, another Celtic cross, erected in St. John's South End by the Three Sisters lamppost.
Yes.
And I believe the area was renamed at that time St. Patrick's Square.
It might have been. I'm not sure at the time, but certainly it's known as St. Patrick's Square. It's also Lower Cove, and a lot of Irish immigrants came in later and settled in Lower Cove. We've talked about that before in the Lower Cove area, and then you can view the harbor and the island itself. And then, Mark, 30 years later, it's 150th.
1997.
In 1997, there was a memorial, another memorial, which you can view at St. Patrick's Square, erected by the St. Patrick's Society, which is one of the oldest voluntary organizations in St. John, I believe, as well as the Irish Canadian Cultural Association, which was formed in the 1980s with a lot of branches around New Brunswick, is still very active. And they commemorated that. And a year later, the president of Ireland visited. And again, because they were still commemorating the famine in Ireland in 1847, 48 onwards, she said she felt at home and paid tribute to the people of St. John in the past who had helped the suffering immigrants of the 1840s. So, looked at the positive aspects, because it wasn't all positive, Mark. There were people, didn't want the immigration ships in their backyards, or sheds in their backyard, so to speak, and a lot of anti-immigrant feeling at the time. But the president of Ireland chose to remember the positive responses and helpful responses of the people of St. John.
Yes, and let's now go to September the 7th this year.
Yeah, I was really honored to go down and witness a ceremony where bronze shoes were installed at Tin Can Beach. It's the south end of St. John, with the view of Partridge Island, and it was part of the Global Irish Famine Way, and as part of the recognition of that global Irish diaspora in the 1840s, working with the Irish Embassy, the Irish Canadian Cultural Association, and also Cultus Culteri Éireann, which is an Irish music and culture and dance international organization that has a very active branch in St. John, and the city of St. John, of course. And I think it's really added to that part of the South End and Tin Can Beach. And I think a lot of people are going to go there and want to touch those bronze shoes. Right? It's very symbolic.
I'm so glad that they chose that as the symbol. Is the child's pair of shoes.
Yeah.
These are actually cast from real child's shoes that were found in a thatch in a bundle in a thatch in a 19th century cottage in Ireland.
Like a
so
thatch
this
roof?
belonged, thatch roof.
Yeah.
So it belonged to a child who likely suffered through the Irish famine. And that always brings it into perspective.
Yeah.
I think it's important when you have these huge events where millions have died, millions displaced, that you bring it back to that individual. And you see the shoes, you see a child's shoes, you can put in a story behind each one of those people who suffered so much.
Yep.
And that becomes that just point of pause and point of ability to put everything into perspective of the suffering of individual humans in such a horrific situation like the Irish famine.
Yeah.
And with that, that's our podcast, Greg. And proof, once again, St. John, nothing happened here.
Thank you for listening to St. John, Nothing Happened Here. To learn more, join us at www.nothinghappenedhere.ca or connect with us on Facebook. Other means of communication include, but are not limited to, telegrams, smoke signals, and carrier pigeons. However you want to reach us, we want to hear from you.